Thank you, President. I'm pleased to rise and speak on Mr Limbrick's bill to repeal the Nuclear Activities Prohibition Act of 1983. The Act that guarantees that Victoria doesn't play a part in the nuclear fuel cycle, that we don't have facilities to support nuclear industry here in Victoria, that we don't produce nuclear power here in Victoria. It is an important piece of legislation, just as important as it was when it was passed 40 years ago. So I thought I'd begin my contribution to today's debate by reflecting on the reasons that the then responsible Minister, the Minister for Minerals and Energy, the Honourable David White, spoke of when he made a contribution in this very chamber on the 9th of December 1982 in the second reading debate, in moving the second reading of the Nuclear Activities Prohibition Bill, as obviously it then was before its passage. Minister White at the time opened his remarks by reflecting on the terrible legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and while I don't think that's going to be the focus of the contributions today, I do think we should start by remembering those who died at the hands of atomic weapons at the end of the Second World War in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and in the words of the Minister at the time, showed the world the destructive potential of nuclear energy. The Minister's second reading speech goes on to talk about other matters associated with the nuclear fuel cycle, and particularly nuclear power. And I think the words that he had at the time, 40 years ago, are as salient today as they were when they were first spoken in this chamber. So I'd like to read some of them out. I quote, "The development of nuclear power reactors was originally held out as offering the promise of convenient, cheap and plentiful electricity. However, experience so far has been otherwise. Reactors have been proved to be very expensive, difficult to locate in the face of public opposition, and there is the unresolved matter of waste disposal and the attendant problems. In addition, there is the problem that the growth in the number of reactors has increased the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation throughout the wider spread of nuclear technology and the risk of nuclear materials being diverted for weapons purposes." The Minister went on to say that beyond these considerations, there's the complex matter of safety. The reactors themselves are proven to be technically difficult to operate and prone to minor mishaps. Now, I'll pause here and just reflect. These comments were made before Chernobyl demonstrated to the world the problems of nuclear meltdown in nuclear energy facilities. So, several years before Chernobyl, the Minister in this place talking about these reactors being, quote, prone to minor mishaps, which can threaten, as the quote continues, to cause disastrous accidents. The Minister then went on to say that a strong body of public opinion has developed opposed to the establishment of a nuclear industry here. And that was, and he said, "This opinion finds expression in all political parties and in all sectors of the community. The Labor Party has for some time held to a policy of opposition to the development of nuclear activities in Victoria, and it is interesting to note that the previous Liberal government," so that was the Thompson Liberal government, "also recorded its opposition to the establishment of either nuclear reactors or enrichment facilities." The Minister's second reading speech, and I won't quote it in full, does go on to describe the various elements of the bill that was introduced to do a range of things, including prohibiting the exploration and mining for uranium or thorium, the construction and the prohibition on the construction and operation of nuclear reactors, facilities for milling uranium or thorium or concentrates, the storage or disposal of nuclear fuel, and the possession, sale and transport of certain nuclear material, and made consequential amendments to other acts, including the State Electricity Commission Act, to prevent the introduction of nuclear energy into our energy mix. The remarks of the minister in 1983 are relevant to today's debate because the fundamental issues that the Labor government was concerned about in 1982, the fundamental issues that the Kane Labor government was concerned about in 1982 relating to both the efficacy of nuclear power and the safety of the nuclear industry and its attendant problems haven't gone away. And the reflection of time, it's interesting to note from a scientific perspective that the passage of 40 years has very little relevance to the nuclear fuel cycle because the half-life of these products is much, much longer. And the danger and the destruction that nuclear fuel and nuclear energy and nuclear waste spans greater periods than just 40 years. They don't even span our lifetimes. They span multiple generations. And it's not something that we can lightly think of removing the important prohibitions against Victoria's participation in the nuclear industry, the nuclear fuel cycle, the creation of nuclear energy and the storage of nuclear waste. Those remarks, that legislation is as important today as it was 40 years ago, and we must oppose all attempts to both remove the prohibition on nuclear energy here in Victoria and other sorts of activities associated with the nuclear fuel cycle, and be steadfast in our opposition. And I'll come to the reasons why, but I think it is fundamentally important that none of the reasons that the former Labor government moved the bill that is sought to be repealed today, none of those reasons have changed. And in fact, over time, many of them have become even more stark. And simply wishing away the problems of the nuclear industry doesn't make it better. Denying the problems of nuclear power doesn't make it safe. And we don't need to look very far back to see the consequences of the dangers of the use of nuclear energy in our fuel cycle. And I'll come to the devastating effects that the accident at the Fukushima nuclear power plant had in the last little more than a decade ago. We don't need to go back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We don't need to just remember what happened at 3 Mile Island. We don't need to just remember what happened at Chernobyl. This century, we've had problems with nuclear energy and the devastating consequences it has. This is a problem for today. This legislation is as important today as it was 40 years ago when this Parliament had the good sense to pass the Prohibition Act. I might say a Parliament that the Labor Party did not control. This chamber was not under the Labor Party's purview at the time of its passage. Correct, and I remember that very well, but I'm not going to get distracted by nuclear issues like that, Mr Davis. What I want to do is go through some of the issues as to why it's important to maintain our prohibition on nuclear power and nuclear energy and the participation in the nuclear fuel cycle, and debunk some of the myths, the dangerous myths that are being peddled by the proponents of nuclear energy in the wider community, and we may see it in the course of this debate. And the first one is about the cost of nuclear energy. And people shouldn't make any mistakes that nuclear power will mean higher power bills for Victorians. And that's for two simple basic facts. Nuclear energy has higher costs to build the reactors and the nuclear power plants. And those nuclear power plants are then more expensive to run on a day-to-day basis. So the proponents of nuclear energy have got to come into this place and explain to us why we should be shouldering generations of Victorians with higher power prices because of a fantasy they have that somehow nuclear energy is the solution to the climate crisis. Because when we see independent evidence presented and findings of the South Australian Government's recent Royal Commission into the nuclear industry, which found quite clearly that nuclear power simply wasn't viable in that state because it was too expensive. What we've seen internationally with the development of nuclear energy and nuclear power stations, notably the Hinkley nuclear reactor in the United Kingdom, which is at this stage 11 years since it was first announced, still not built, and billions of pounds over budget, costs that that British consumers of that energy will be paying for generations thereafter. Nuclear power means higher power bills, and proponents of nuclear power need to explain why they support higher power bills for ordinary Victorians. The other thing, and I briefly mentioned this, is that not only that nuclear reactors, nuclear power is expensive to build and takes an inordinate amount of time to get off the ground. It is not an answer to the problems that we are facing as part of our energy transition. If people are worried about energy security here in Victoria, if people are concerned that there won't be enough power when the ageing coal-fired power stations in the Latrobe Valley come to the end of their life, nuclear is not an answer to that problem. Because even if we thought it was a good idea, and even if we started on the dangerous nuclear energy path today, those coal-fired power plants would be long gone before the nuclear power came online. They are not a solution to that problem. And the third thing I'll say is that there's this kind of fantasy being peddled now by the nuclear industry that somehow we've got new technology that's going to fix all of these problems. Even if you accept that it was too long and too costly to build the nuclear reactors of old, suddenly we've got brand new technology, these small modular reactors that somehow are sweeping the world and somehow transforming nuclear energy across the world. Well, they are a chimera. They are a mirage. They do not exist. And people who peddle small modular reactors as the solution to our energy transition are charlatans. A couple of things I'll say about small modular reactors. And it's, people might not have picked it up in the name, Acting President, but a small modular reactor is small. Small. So let's do a point of comparison. A small modular reactor, if they existed, would have the capacity to generate around 300 megawatts of power. Loy Yang A, which is what some people are saying these nuclear reactors could replace, currently generates 2,200 megawatts of electricity, 2.2 gigawatts. Small modular reactors, 300 megawatts. So you'd need 8 small nuclear reactors to replace Loy Yang A. You'd need 8 or 9 to replace the energy that's proposed to be brought into the grid by the Star of the South, for example. So the question we've got is, should we build 1 new offshore wind facility or 8 nuclear reactors? That's the comparison that we should be making. And I say that's the comparison we should be making, but it's not a real comparison, because unlike things like the offshore wind industry, unlike other renewable projects, small modular reactors, small nuclear reactors, they don't exist. There isn't one that works anywhere in the world. Nowhere. Nowhere. So when people come in and say, oh, they're the solution, small nuclear reactors are the solution, they can't actually point to one that exists, because there isn't one anywhere in the world. And only last week, one of the proponents, one of the projects to demonstrate just how fantastic small modular reactors are in the United States collapsed, fell over, was cancelled. Just to read you some of the headlines, I probably don't have time to go through all of the articles, but small modular, this is from The Guardian, small modular nuclear reactor that was hailed by coalition as the future, cancelled due to rising costs. In the AFR, flagship US nuclear reactor project collapses, owing taxpayers $930 million. In the Sydney Morning Herald, US reactor project fail heats up Australia's nuclear power debate. I actually don't think it does heat up Australia's nuclear power debate. I think it puts it to bed. I think the failures of these projects in the United States, there were only, interestingly, if you read the article in some depth, these projects were only sustainable because of the massive government subsidies that they were receiving. So when people come into this chamber and decry the amount of money that governments give to industry in what some people would call forms of corporate welfare, what we see from the experience in the United States is that the solutions that they advocate are only sustained by the very subsidies that they decry. And then the projects fall over and there's nothing left to be seen. Small nuclear reactors aren't real. They're imaginary. They don't exist, and they shouldn't be taken seriously in any debate about what to do with our energy transition. I've mentioned briefly the problems with nuclear energy and nuclear power, but it should be worth remembering, because if we are to have 8 nuclear reactors built here in Victoria to replace Loy Yang A, or as an alternative to Star of the South, my question simply is to those who argue they're a good idea, where should we put them? Who's putting their hand up to have a nuclear reactor in their community? I hear stunning silence from across the chamber, because no one is putting their hand up to have nuclear power in their backyard. No one's putting their hand up to have 1 nuclear reactor in their community, let alone 8 nuclear reactors that we would need to replace the power that's coming out of Loy Yang A, or the power that could be going into our grid by something like the Star of the South offshore wind project. So people who propose nuclear reactors need to tell us where they're going to go. And mostly we know that they need to be in places that are near water. Because what are some of the things that our nuclear reactors need in order to generate nuclear energy? They need water. Not just a little bit, Minister for Water, with a very helpful interjection, not just a little bit. They need large volumes of water to generate, to participate in the cooling of the reactors and to generate the power that people claim is so lucrative that they bring. So my next question is, where's the water coming from? And there are 2 sources of water that we can use in the production of nuclear energy. We can use seawater, which requires vast amounts of additional power to desalinate in order to put it into the reactors. Something that's been opposed, but also something that takes up a large part of the output of the nuclear reactor. So you set up these nuclear reactors, 8 of them, somewhere in various locations across the state. If they're next on the coast, which is where the sea is, so I don't know which coastal communities you're saying need to have nuclear reactors next to there. Maybe, who knows? Yeah, beach boxes, nuclear reactor. Who thought? But most of that energy, a lot of that energy is then tied up in making sure they can actually use the water to produce the remainder of power. Of course, the second source of water that we didn't have to desalinate would need to come from agricultural production. So my question to those who participate in this debate is, what are you telling the farmers? What are you telling the irrigators who would have to have their water for agricultural production diverted into these nuclear power plants. They're the people who'll end up paying the most for this, because you can't just turn these plants off. You can't decide in 5 years, actually, we don't have as much water as we used to. There's been some climatic changes which have reduced the amount of reduced the amount of rainfall, reduced the amount of water available in our environment. We don't have enough to both sustain our nuclear power plant and irrigate our crops. Can we switch it off, please? And unfortunately, you can't. You can't turn them off. They're there for all of their life. If you divert the water away from these nuclear power plants, they melt down, like what happened in Chernobyl, like what happened at 3 Mile Island. And then suddenly these communities are not just left with more expensive power, they're left with a radioactive landscape. That's the future that you're proposing. That's the future that could await if the Nuclear Prohibitions Act is repealed. The other and probably last point that I'll make, so that others have a chance to contribute to this debate, is that in addition to the 8 nuclear reactors that we'd need to build here in Victoria, the 8 small nuclear reactors that we'd need to build here in Victoria, we still don't have a solution for our radioactive waste, for our nuclear waste. And that's the other question that people have got to ask and answer. Where are you going to put the radioactive waste that you generate from these facilities? And again, no one in the course of this debate who gets up and advocates for nuclear power is willing to put their hand up and say, I want a radioactive waste dump, a nuclear waste dump in our community. But none of the people participating in this debate are willing to do that. If this waste is being generated in Victoria, if we generate nuclear energy in Victoria, we should have the waste in our state. But we don't even have one in Australia. There is no national radioactive waste management facility anywhere in the country, despite decades of trying to get there. But of course, if we're using small nuclear reactors, they actually produce more waste. So not only do they use our drinking water, and not only do you need more of them, that if they existed, they would actually generate between 2, 3, maybe 10 times as much radioactive waste because of the methods that they use to enrich the uranium and make the reactions than other sorts of nuclear energy facilities. So they produce more waste. Again, where does the waste go? In whose communities will it sit? Those are the questions we need answered in the course of this debate if people are willing to do it. There are enormous number of reasons why nuclear energy is a bad idea for everyone, especially why nuclear energy is a bad idea for Victoria. There's a choice. It's always good to have choices in politics because they're pretty stark. This government has a plan to transition our energy mix towards renewable energy. We think the future is renewable, not radioactive. And we've got a plan to generate more renewable energy here in Victoria. Not only do we have a plan, we're actually doing it. And I'm sure that others in the course of this debate and others in the course of other debates have demonstrated quite clearly just how far Victoria's come, the most rapidly decarbonising energy system in the nation, smashing our renewable energy targets, taking carbon out of our electricity generation. What we shouldn't replace it with is something like radioactive materials that are thirsty for our agricultural water for a lifetime, and where we've got radioactive waste that we don't know what to do with. All the while, if all of those problems weren't bad enough, Acting President, what Victorians would be left with is higher power bills forever. That's the choice. Cheaper renewables, more expensive radioactive energy. And unless people can come into this chamber in the course of this debate and tell people where the 8 nuclear reactors are going to go, where the radioactive waste dump is going to be located, and where the water's coming from to make it all work, they can't be taken seriously. Nuclear power is dangerous, it's expensive, and it should not be part of Victoria's future.
Thank you, Mr Batchelor. Mr Davis.
Acting